Chapter 10. Royal security was the idea of Death Eater Walden McNair. Installed as minister to the crown, Wizard McNair introduced and got the Royal Security Bill passed after a terrorist explosion destroyed half of Buckingham Palace, killing Prince Charles and leaving young Prince William heir to the crown. The Office of Royal Security, referred to as Muggle Security by the Wizards, was charged with the responsibility to investigate terrorist activities. With the assistance of Wizard Lucius Malfoy, serving office as Muggle Prime Minister, the scope and power of Royal Security was gradually increased until today it had free rein to hunt, seize, and prosecute any and all persons suspected of terrorist activities. Royal Security officials appeared at the site of every major crime, conducting interviews and collecting evidence. They could be seen frequently patrolling the streets, keeping the peace, and making arrests of terrorist suspects. The public news often broadcasted the results of Royal Security arrests, usually in the form of detailed confessions to some terrorist crime. With no need for a trial, the guilty person was often carted off to an unnamed jail for an unspecified length of time. No one picked up by Royal Security ever went to court or got released, but that was a fact omitted by the public news. Actually, the Muggles were witnessing Wizard Security in action while seizing mudblood families and fugitive wizards. Wizard Security officials wore uniforms identical to those of Royal Security. No outsider could tell the difference. The publicized confessions were totally false. The written ones were imagined stories with realistic signatures affixed to them. The voluntary verbal confessions aired over radio and television were achieved through either modified memories or the Imperious Curse. But the Muggles didn't know that either. The news reports constantly reminded the public of the impressive solve rate of the Royal Security and how fortunate people were that Royal Security had been there to catch the criminals. The Muggles wanted to believe Royal Security was protecting them and that they were safer because of it. The Muggles were happy to not ask too many questions when presented with easy explanations. The main work of Royal Security was publicity. It worked to promote the Royal Security image. Royal Security officials sent out the press releases to the Muggle news. In addition, Royal Security officers kept track of any criticism of Royal Security or the current regime. They were in charge of silencing that criticism. The method of silencing was left to the imagination of the Royal Security officers. They could do just about anything, as long as they didn't generate too much negative publicity or actually kill someone. If Royal Security efforts did not stop the negative criticism, the case was turned over to the Wizard Security to investigate. That usually meant a visit by the new Death Eaters. The visit generally resulted in a new terrorist attack or a terrorist murder victim case, to be solved at a later date. Royal Security worked closely with Wizard Security. It sent out Wizard Security alerts and other Wizard notices, making sure they got printed and or aired promptly in the Muggle media. It followed up on any Muggle reports concerning Wizard Security alerts, keeping the Wizards informed at all times. Royal Security officials coordinated Muggle search efforts for terrorist suspects. The names of those who hindered a terrorist search effort were added onto an unfavorable criticism list for future investigation. Royal Security officials also investigated Muggle tips from the terrorist tip line. They turned over all interviews and reports to their superiors, the new Death Eaters, for interpretation. Royal Security officials identified terrorist-related persons of interest, apprehending them when possible. Any person they picked up remained in a special detention cell in the Royal Security office until a member of Wizard Security arrived to collect the person for interrogation. Royal Security officials were basically a bunch of thugs, hand-picked by Wizard Thorfinn Roll, head of Royal Security. There was also a sprinkling of psychopaths, killers, and minor criminals within their ranks. Daniel suspected they had all been selected for their propensity to frighten others and keep secrets rather than intellectual ability. They all expected one day to be admitted into the higher ranks of Royal Security, Wizard Security, to become one of those privileged to work behind the red security doors and make major arrests. That would never happen, of course, as they were Muggles, but no one told them that. In the meantime, The Royal Security officials worked hard at their jobs, cheerfully intimidating and terrorizing those foolish enough to criticize Royal Security or the current government. When Daniel made deliveries to Royal Security, he had to act like a Death Eater. It was what the Royal Security employees expected. It took a bigger thug to keep the Royal Security officials in line. To do less would undermine wizard authority of Royal Security. Daniel knew of only one Death Eater well enough to imitate. The marsh mist swirled around their bodies as Daniel and Richard stepped into the Royal Security office. Both of them stopped 2 steps beyond the door so it could close. The door had opened silently at the rear of a rectangular room. All the desks faced forward, except one, that of the Royal Station Commander, Clust Sloane. He, alone, saw Daniel and Richards enter. Commander Sloane was a big, muscular man with short, regulation-cut, brown hair. He stood up hastily at their arrival. "Stand for inspection," the commander announced sharply. Immediately, a scraping sound occurred, indicating several chairs had been moved hastily back. Daniel surveyed the room with narrowed eyes. 4 Royal Security officers stood facing forward while hurriedly straightening their uniforms. Even from their backs, Daniel recognized them all. He had visited this office frequently and had taken the time to read the personnel files and background checks of everyone who worked here. 2 desks were empty. Daniel fixed his eyes on Commander Sloane. He had been commander for almost 4 years, having been promoted to the position when the previous commander lost control and killed several Muggle suspects with no terrorist connections. Killing was a privilege reserved for the Death Eaters. Sloane was the only person in the office married and with a family. His wife had filed numerous complaints with the local police against Sloane for assault and battery, but that was all before Sloane joined Royal Security. Given the nature of his work on the job, Sloane hadn't felt the need to hit his wife while at home. Their marriage was flourishing now. Sloane was a reasonably competent person, able to complete the work required of him. "Status report?" asked Daniel softly, his upper lip curling slightly. Commander Sloane shifted uncomfortably when Daniel spoke. Daniel knew why, but he would get to that later. Nielsen and Killian are off investigating an explosion this morning," he began. As far as Daniel knew, the explosion in question was not a wizard thing, but due to Muggle causes. That was nothing they needed to know. Perhaps some wizard in security might later decide to attribute the explosion to a known terrorist or fugitive wizard. "Koberic and Drudwin are reviewing the news for signs of terrorist collaborators," continued the commander. "Lysander is drafting the weekly public report, and Hinwis is taking information on royal tip calls." Commander Sloane stopped speaking and waited for Daniel to respond. Daniel continued to stare menacingly at Commander Sloane without speaking. Unnerved, Commander Sloane fidgeted. That's all, sir," he added uncertainly, knowing he had missed something, but not what. "And yourself?" whispered Daniel with a sneer, his upper lip curled with disapproval. I'm looking up the addresses of terrorist collaborators to visit, sir," said Commander Sloane. "That is not your responsibility," said Daniel softly, still staring at him. No, sir, but see, everyone else was busy, and I wanted to interrogate some of them today." Commander Sloane's voice trailed off when he got no reaction from Daniel. Daniel glided silently forward, passing the officers at their desks, stopping in front of Commander Sloane's desk. "I received a report from your office this morning," he said quietly, while looking directly at Commander Sloane. There was absolute silence in the office, and he didn't have to speak very loudly to be heard. Daniel stared menacingly at Commander Sloane, not finishing his sentence, forcing Commander Sloane to respond. "Oh?" Sweat was pouring down Commander Sloane's face, and he licked his lips nervously. "The numbers don't seem correct," added Daniel, with a sneer on his lips. "What?" "You look in good health," observed Daniel quietly, seeming to change the subject. "Fit and trim." Thank you, sir." "I cannot imagine," he added silkily, "why your cash receipts from the cafe last Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday would seem to indicate you purchased enough food for 2 full meals each day. Commander Sloane reddened. Did you manage to eat all that by yourself, or did you, by chance, treat a companion to lunch? No, of course not. I was just hungry, denied Commander Sloane, sweating profusely, giving lie to his own words. It was a mistake, Commander Sloane added lamely, wilting under Daniel's intense stare. Such mistakes are unacceptable, said Daniel icily. I did not see any request for vehicle repairs, he swiftly added, changing the subject. What? You purchased a full tank worth of petrol in Purley when interviewing witnesses in Addiscombe, despite the fact you checked out a vehicle already indicating a full tank. Purley is not even in the same direction as Addiscombe, sneered Daniel. Surely the vehicle was not functioning properly for you to end up there on the way to Addiscombe. I don't know what you mean. You should, snapped Daniel sharply, making Commander Sloane nearly jump in place. Because the document has your signature on it. The nice thing about Fearful was that it made people with a guilty conscience look even guiltier. Commander Sloane was looking very guilty now. The inconsistency with numbers had been deliberate, a small attempt to fix the books to see if it would go unnoticed, a prelude for larger fixes in the future. That must be some mistake, admitted Commander Sloane, his hands visibly shaking. Indeed, said Daniel softly. A second mistake? He sneered in disbelief. Very sloppy. Are there others? He asked silkily. There were, but Daniel didn't force the commander to answer. Instead, Daniel added, perhaps you would like to resubmit your report with corrections. Yes, said Commander Sloane, nearly wilting with relief. Yes, I would, sir. Thank you, sir. And the slot by the end of the day, snapped Daniel, nodding his head towards the mail slot at the operating door. I will read it very closely, Daniel told him. See that you are more careful with your math in the future, he instructed. Commander Sloane nodded. Yes, sir, he agreed. Letting Commander Sloane call it a mistake enabled him to save face in front of his employees, but he knew what Daniel meant. Attempts to fix reports for personal purposes would not go unnoticed. Hopefully the rest of the office personnel listening in got the message too. Daniel wheeled around, surveying the rest of the Royal Security officers. The 4 stood at attention, facing straight ahead, trying hard to not stare at him. Daniel glided away from Commander Sloane's desk. He moved slowly down the aisle towards the back, pausing at the first desk to observe Koberic sweat and squirm uncomfortably before him. That was the normal reaction when someone was under the effects of Fearful. Without a word, Daniel stepped to the next desk in the row and paused to glare at Lysander. Lysander bore Daniel's scrutiny confidently, staring back, with his icy blue eyes challenging Daniel. Alfred Lysander was short and slender, with blonde, almost white hair. He was impeccably groomed and looked the perfect picture of innocence, the average guy on the street. Yet Daniel knew Lysander had coolly stabbed 3 people, calmly cleaned up afterwards, and walked away without a second thought. The background checks were very thorough. In addition, potential employees received an intense interrogation while under the influence of veritaserum. Not that they remembered it, of course. Lysander had never been caught or convicted for the murders. His crime was of no importance to royal security. It was only concerned with job performance and current behavior, not past misdeeds. Daniel moved to the right of Lysander, lingering at a third desk used by Dwayne Henwis. Henwis was not Daniel's actual target, but standing in front of his desk gave Daniel an excellent view of the person he wanted to watch, Lysander. Lysander had been too calm, too confident. Daniel looked Henwis over, all the while watching Lysander from the corner of his eye. Henwis was tall and solidly built, yet cropped black hair and mean black eyes. He liked his job. He had been recruited out of the country jail, having accidentally killed a person during a bar fight. Henwis had been pleased to learn his criminal past had not disqualified him from employment at Royal Security. Any useful tips, Officer Henwis? Daniel asked. Lysander had shifted his position slightly, so he was still facing Daniel. There was an odd gleam to the security pin in his lapel. It hadn't gleamed like that during his last visit. Henwis looked down at his desk and picked up his notes. There was no similar gleam to his security pin. Yes, he replied, looking at his notes. It seems there is a credible sighting of fugitive number 653. Then you should investigate further, replied Daniel softly. Daniel knew fugitive number 653 was runner Glenn Davies. Royal security officials never referred to anyone by name, if possible. They thought fugitive number 653 had hacked a state computer, stolen information on royal security official personnel, and given it to terrorists. Daniel had no doubt Glenn would easily evade the royal security investigators. He had been on the run for almost a year now and could clearly take care of himself. His parents reported Glenn's absence within 24 hours of running, indicating to Daniel that it was probably a planned run. The parents might have even assisted making sure Glenn was safely out of sight before notifying security. Their prompt notification of security enabled the parents to avoid any fines or non-head counts. When Glenn was ready to return, he would probably turn himself in at a security station, minimizing arrest charges. If Daniel actually saw Glenn, or was assigned Glenn's case, he would try to bring him in, of course. But in the meantime, Daniel wished Glenn well. Memories of a successful run could sustain one a long time when dealing with the drudgery of everyday non-life afterwards. Memories of Daniel's own run, though not nearly as long or successful, had kept Daniel going through many a cold, depressing day at work. It had also inspired him to work in security. Daniel had made his break while still attending Hogwarts. The train had just begun its run when upperclassman Slytherin Malcolm Baddock hunted Daniel out and promised Daniel that they would be spending a lot of time together after class, and he had plans for Daniel. In a panic, Daniel jumped the Hogwarts Express, intending to go anywhere but school. Unfortunately, Daniel broke his wrist during the fall. Afraid of pursuit, Daniel fled quickly away from the rails and through the forest, heedless of the branches and brambles he encountered along the way. He plunged recklessly into one clump of bushes and came out on the other side at the edge of a steep ravine. Exhausted and unbalanced, Daniel fell down the ravine, losing both his wand and consciousness along the way. When he awoke, Daniel found himself half in, half out a cold stream of water, with more cuts, scrapes, and bruises than he could ever imagine. The area was so remote that Daniel stumbled around in pain for several days before being found by some muggles. Believing Daniel to be a terrorist murderer, the muggles immediately notified royal security. Daniel ran in fear at the sight of the royal security uniform and fought back rather than be captured and returned to Hogwarts. His efforts were unsuccessful. Weakened from the cold, pain, and lack of food, Daniel was no match for the royal security officials. They easily beat him into submission, breaking several ribs and a jaw in the process. Then they liberally used their boots, stomping on Daniel's hands, breaking 4 fingers and numerous hand bones, kicking Daniel numerous times until he was unconscious. Finally, the royal security officials, tired of their sport, and put a battered, broken, and bloodied Daniel in their containment cell to await interrogation. Wizard security officials collected Daniel soon after and transported him to security headquarters. When Daniel refused to answer questions, he had been barely conscious at the time, the wizards tossed him into their holding cell to await trial. They made no effort to contact anyone on Daniel's behalf, preferring to let Daniel suffer in isolation with a Dementor for company. In the end, Daniel had gotten out only because Headmaster Snape had come to the station to seek and identify his missing student. The headmaster's Patronus chased away the Dementor circling Daniel's cell, enabling Daniel to think clearly again, without overwhelming despair. Then Headmaster Snape looked Daniel over carefully and glared at the security witch. "Release him, Edgecombe," the headmaster ordered. "No," she responded imperiously. "By order of Wizard McNair, all fugitive wizards must go to trial for their crimes." "He's not an adult wizard yet, and his only crime is truancy," insisted the headmaster. "That is a Hogwarts affair. Your imprisonment is keeping him from school. Release him," he ordered again. I can't, insisted Witch Edgecombe. He resisted arrest and refused to answer questions. Those crimes have nothing to do with truancy. I've read the report, snapped Headmaster Snape. He resisted muggles. Since when is it a crime for a wizard to do that? And he is in no condition to answer questions. Even you should have realized that. However, this boy is clearly school-aged and obviously truant. He needs only to be sent back to school, where he belongs. He has yet to be identified, protested Witch Edgecombe obstinately. I'm identifying him, said Headmaster Snape. Then he added in a voice barely above a whisper, Do you accuse me of being inaccurate? No, stammered Witch Edgecombe. But I still can't. Headmaster Snape raised his wand and deliberately pointed it at Witch Edgecombe. I tire of your excuses, he said coldly. Release the boy. Witch Edgecombe grew pale. How dare you threaten me, she said, pulling out her own wand. Her voice trembled in anger. The rules state I dare, because I am the headmaster of Hogwarts. Headmaster Snape interrupted softly. His black eyes glittered dangerously. The rules do not apply to me. You would be wise to remember that. Put your wand away, he commanded. You may wear a security uniform, but you are the same sniveling brat I once taught and should have never been resorted into Slytherin, polluting our numbers. Though I doubt the Nons would ever accept you either, he added, as his upper lip curled in disgust. Daniel stared at the headmaster in surprise. It was the nearest to a compliment he had ever heard anyone say about Nons. If you insist, continued Headmaster Snape softly, with a sneer, we can take this up directly with Wizard McNair, at which time I shall inform him how you failed to report the boy's presence to me for identification as soon as he was brought in, compounding his truancy. But, in addition, I shall inform him how it shall take additional days in the infirmary before the boy shall recover enough to attend class, let alone serve detention for his truancy. He's just a non, protested Witch Edgecombe, her voice tinged with disgust. He is still a pure-blood wizard, Edgecombe, and should be treated as such, countered Headmaster Snape coldly. His condition is disgraceful. Now, continued Headmaster Snape softly, with a sneer, will you turn the boy over to me, or shall we visit Wizard McNair? I believe he is in conference with the Dark Lord right now. No doubt he would like to be disturbed on such an important issue as this. Witch Edgecombe paled at the suggestion. She moved forward reluctantly and opened the cell door. Daniel struggled to stand, but he didn't get very far. Well, said Headmaster Snape impatiently, remove him. Me, protested Witch Edgecombe. Opening the door was one thing, helping Daniel was quite another. I don't see anyone else, replied Headmaster Snape icily, his black eyes glittering slits. I believe you are in charge of your prisoners until they leave the station. Perhaps you should keep them in better condition, so you don't have to personally carry them away. Witch Edgecombe reluctantly pocketed her wand and slowly stepped inside the cell. She placed her hand under Daniel's armpit and lifted. Then she not too gently hauled an unresisting Daniel out of the cell while Headmaster Snape stood by, watching. Then Headmaster Snape pocketed his own wand, deliberately turned his back on Witch Edgecombe, and swept out of the room, his black robes billowing behind. Daniel saw a look of hatred and determination flash across Witch Edgecombe's face, as if considering a sneak wand attack, but it vanished quickly, and an attack never occurred. Instead, Witch Edgecombe dragged Daniel along, adding cuts and scrapes to Daniel's already well-bruised body, while she followed Headmaster Snape to the apparating chamber. What do I say in my report? She asked as they reached the chamber. That, said Headmaster Snape imperiously, in a very soft voice, is your problem. He opened the door and stepped aside to permit Witch Edgecombe to drag Daniel within. Headmaster Snape followed behind. The witch dumped Daniel unceremoniously inside the chamber and left, leaving Daniel alone with the headmaster. When the door closed, Headmaster Snape wound his slender fingers in Daniel's curly hair, pulling Daniel's head up, and the two apparated to the train station in Hogsmeade. The headmaster released his grip on Daniel's hair, and Daniel slumped down onto the rough platform planks, driving splinters in his hands and knees. A horseless carriage arrived to take the two to Hogwarts. Headmaster Snape watched without comment while Daniel slowly and painfully dragged himself into the carriage. Then the headmaster got in and sat down beside Daniel. The carriage took off, rolling down the road. It jolted Daniel agonizingly with every bump in the road. "I expect you realize by now that there is no place to run," commented Headmaster Snape dryly after a particularly pronounced jolt knocked Daniel to one side, causing him to moan in pain. The headmaster pulled something out of his pocket and handed it to Daniel. It was a small chunk of chocolate. "It might even occur to you that there are places worse than Hogwarts," the headmaster added unsympathetically, while Daniel managed to force the chocolate between his swollen lips. The chocolate was unsweetened and very bitter, but it did make Daniel feel a bit better. "You refused to answer their questions," the headmaster continued. "That was very foolish." Daniel closed his eyes and dropped his head in too much pain to respond. Fortunately, the headmaster didn't seem to expect any. "It occurs to me," the headmaster said speculatively, "that you might have been more cooperative had you been questioned by a non. You might have even been released sooner and in better condition." They rode on in silence. The carriage continued to jerk about, and Daniel stifled a moan of pain with every bump. After a while they reached the walls of Hogwarts. The gates swung silently open, letting the carriage through. Just before the carriage stopped at the entrance, Headmaster Snape added softly, "Pity there aren't any nons working in security." Then the headmaster got out of the carriage, instructed two nearby nons to take Daniel up to the infirmary. When Daniel recovered, he was assigned 3 weeks of detention, 2 days of detention for every day of school missed. Malcolm Baddock was assigned to supervise Daniel's detention. The first week was every bit as torturous as Malcolm had earlier so gleefully promised. But by the second week, Malcolm tired of tormenting Daniel. He tried to dump the detention responsibility on a classmate. Headmaster Snape found out and insisted Malcolm continue conducting detention. When Malcolm protested, the headmaster replied coldly, "Perhaps in the future, Mr. Baddock, you will reconsider the practice of pushing people so hard they crack. It can lead to unwanted consequences." And Daniel suddenly realized that his detention was also Malcolm's punishment for forcing Daniel to run in the first place, for making Daniel miss school. Headmaster Snape had never once asked Daniel why he had run. He must have already known and not approved. As painful as it was for Daniel, the detention was also a 3-week commitment of Malcolm's time, 5 hours every day after dinner, in which Malcolm had to supervise Daniel somehow, when Malcolm could neither socialize with friends nor complete his own assignments. Malcolm left Daniel alone after that. As soon as Daniel finished Hogwarts, nons didn't graduate. Daniel remembered the headmaster's words and those of his father. Then he put in an application to security. "Officer Kuberik," snapped Daniel suddenly, turning his attention to the other side of Lysander. "What is Regulation 23, Sentence 1 of the Royal Security Manual?" Myrna Kuberik jumped at the command and stood even straighter, if possible. She was a short, wiry person with cold hazel eyes and dirty blonde hair. Kuberik had just joined Royal Security and was both eager and very ambitious. "No person shall give out any information concerning the identities of persons employed by Royal Security, sir," she shouted quickly, proud she knew the answer. Daniel gave a slight nod of approval and a smirk of satisfaction. He knew Kuberik could get that answer right. She was very smart. Besides having an above-average intelligence, test results showed that Kuberik had memorized the security regulations, using them word for word in her answers. If she ever tried to defraud Royal Security, it would be very difficult to detect. Kuberik also liked to torture and kill small animals. That was of no consequence to her wizard employers, as long as she was discreet and did it after hours. However, Daniel would think twice before he ever spent time with her alone, even armed with his wand. "And the reason for this regulation, Officer Drudwin?" Daniel asked sharply. Emery's Drudwin gave a start from his desk, behind Officer Kuberik. He was average size, but very muscular. To protect royal security officials from retaliation by terrorists, sir, Drudwin answered promptly. It did more, of course. It kept the Muggle public from knowing who worked for royal security. They might not feel so secure once they read the background and criminal records of the royal security employees. The regulations also kept Muggles from learning about the very secret security officials referred to by the royal security employees as the Reds. Those nameless people who came out from behind the red security doors and roamed the streets under the guise of royal security. Watching carefully, Daniel saw a moment of uncertainty flash across Lysander's face. Snap quizzes concerning regulations was not unusual, but the subject of these questions seemed disconcerting. Remove your security pin and place it on your desk, Officer Drudwin, ordered Daniel quietly, his lip curled in a sneer. Sir? Questioned Drudwin. His voice sounded hurt, uncertain, and upset. He liked his job and enjoyed intimidating people. The occasional perks were good, too. Daniel knew Drudwin was in the habit of taking cash and money from the houses of people he interviewed. They weren't in a position to complain. Unlike Sloane, who had tried to steal from royal security, theft from a terrorist suspect was perfectly admissible, as long as it was kept quiet. Remove it now, demanded Daniel sharply. Drudwin jumped, and his trembling hand automatically moved to obey. Lysander relaxed visibly. He was again calm and confident as he listened to Daniel's words. The reason for Daniel's visit was clear. Drudwin was in trouble. Removal of a security pin was the first part in the dismissal ritual. Drudwin pulled the pin from his lapel and placed it on the desk. He looked uncertainly, fearfully up at Daniel. But Daniel was looking at Henwis. Remove your security pin, Officer Henwis, he ordered softly. Henwis reluctantly put his hands on his lapel to remove his pin. Officer Lysander, continued Daniel, his lips curled in a sneer, remove your pin and place it on the desk. Panic crossed the face of Officer Lysander. Remove your pin as well, Officer Kuberik, added Daniel softly. Officer Kuberik complied swiftly, placing her pin on the desk in front of her. And you, Commander Sloane, hissed Daniel, turning his head to face him. Remove the pin, he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he watched Sloane comply. There was silence again in the room, as everyone wondered what Daniel would do next. Daniel returned his attention to Lysander. Well, he whispered expectantly, and all eyes turned to the one person who had not removed his pin. Is there something wrong? My pin, he said, taking a step backwards. It's stuck. The earlier cool confidence had been replaced by worry and concern. I can't get it off. Perhaps your co-workers could help, suggested Daniel silkily, watching Lysander steadily with narrowed eyes. No, I don't need help, said Lysander, taking another step back, looking warily around at the other people in the office. They were staring back at him with growing suspicion. Clearly something was wrong, and Lysander was looking guiltier by the second. I can do it myself, he added, putting his hands up to the lapel, taking another step backwards. I just didn't want to rip my unit. Lysander suddenly made a dash, leaping Officer Nielsen's unattended desk and heading towards the nearest exit, the red door, and Richard's. Total pandemonium ensued as the other officers broke ranks and charged after him. There was a logic behind Lysander's actions. Richards was clearly the youngest person in the room, an unknown and probably the most vulnerable. Perhaps Lysander thought he could take Richards hostage and escape out the red door. Lysander didn't know there was no escape within the red room. Lysander didn't have much of a lead. Hopefully, the other officers would catch him quickly. Daniel shifted his position so he could get at his nightstick easily, but otherwise stood still, appearing calm and detached during the commotion. Like Richards, Daniel wasn't allowed to use his wand here, but better him than Richards. If necessary, Daniel would create some diversion while everyone was looking at Lysander. It would be worse if Daniel permitted Richards to get captured or harmed. Daniel watched Richards closely as well. If the charge caused Richards to panic and use his wand, the situation could become a major cleanup mess. Richards had paled considerably when Lysander first headed his way. His eyes remained riveted on Lysander, and his hand gripped his nightstick tightly, but he didn't move. Lysander was pulled down less than a meter away from Richards. The three other officers made short work of Lysander. Henwis and Drudwin flipped Lysander onto his back and held him down, while Koberic planted a knee in his chest and tore the pin from the lapel. She held the pin up high for all to see while bringing it triumphantly back to Daniel. Daniel held out his gloved hand and she placed it in the palm. It was not a security pin. It looked to be a tiny recording camera of some sort. "Search him," Daniel ordered softly, knowing there would be more to make the device operate. Henwis continued to hold the struggling Lysander down while Drudwin moved expertly to search him. Drudwin knew every possible hiding place. He had been a prison guard before being dismissed for excessive violence. In a few minutes, Drudwin stood up. "Look at this," he said, holding a shoe up and pointing to the sole. He gave the shoe to Koberic, who placed it on the desk in front of Daniel. Daniel nodded in approval. He placed the tiny camera in his pocket and picked up the shoe, examining it carefully. It was a regulation-style shoe, but the sole had been cleverly slit to add a third layer, one that stuck out slightly on the inside. With his gloved hand, Daniel depressed the inner side of the sole, and it stayed in place. Clearly, it was a switch of some sort. Daniel carefully stowed the shoe out of sight within his jacket. Then he looked up at Drudwin and Henwis. "Bring him here," Daniel hissed softly. Drudwin helped Henwis lift Lysander, and the two dragged him, still struggling, over to Daniel. Then Drudwin expertly placed Lysander in a chokehold around his neck while holding him up to face Daniel. Lysander was breathing heavily from his exertions, and he no longer looked cool and confident. His jacket was torn and covered with dirt. His pale blonde hair stuck out wildly, and his ice-blue eyes flickered back and forth like those of a trapped animal. "How long," Daniel asked quietly, "have you been betraying your comrades?" "What?" asked Lysander, momentarily confused. He looked at the grim faces of his co-workers. "I didn't betray—" Then understanding flashed across his face. "No," he protested loudly. "I never used it on them. I wouldn't." He looked around again and saw only cold, unbelieving faces. "I only turned it on today," he said earnestly. "I swear." Daniel fixed his eyes on Lysander and remained silent, a sneer curling on his lips. "It was you they wanted, not them, honest," Lysander added desperately, looking truly fearful now, not sure which was worse, his co-workers or Daniel. Daniel nodded a fraction, satisfied with the answer. Lysander was probably telling the truth. In his current state, it would be very difficult for him to lie convincingly. The bottom of the red door always leaked a small bit of fearful to keep people away. Lysander had gotten a second dose when he fell so near Richards. Unfortunately, his co-workers had gotten a second dose of fearful while bringing Lysander down. They would not be so easy to convince. They were worried what might happen to them should the public get a hold of their past criminal records. "Who?" demanded Daniel in a whisper, changing the subject. "I don't know," replied Lysander quickly. "It was just a voice on a phone, a packet with directions, and a lot of money." The fearful had taken total control of him. He was babbling now, too terrified to think clearly, and hoping rapid cooperation would help convince Daniel of his honesty. It worked. Lysander was describing exactly how the Muggle underground operated. It was just a small, disorganized section of the Muggle population who believed royal security did more damage than good, and actually tried to do something about it. Usually, its members tried to collect information about the royal security for future use, either as negative publicity or in Parliament. Being highly illegal, their efforts were cloaked in secrecy. Anything less would have gotten them killed. Daniel believed Lysander knew nothing further. But that was not the end of the matter. Lysander had plainly broken royal security regulations. Daniel turned slightly towards Commodore Sloane. "Perhaps you would like to handle this matter and investigate further," Daniel suggested softly. "I would indeed," growled Commander Sloane. Like Daniel, he had not moved from his place during Lysander's break for freedom. He now came forward, happy to take charge. Having suffered his own humiliations at the hands of Daniel, he no doubt would make an example of Lysander to offset it. Commander Sloane looked grimly at Lysander's now panicked face. "I think we need to confirm he's not carrying anything else," he began. Yes, agreed Daniel with a sneer. A full-body strip search might be in order. I'd like to volunteer, sir, spoke up Corberic quickly. Her cold hazel eyes sparkled with excitement, and there was a malicious smile on her face. Lysander's body jerked violently. No, he shouted in protest. His arms flailed about desperately in a renewed effort to break the hold on his neck. He obviously knew what she did in her spare time. Very well, agreed Sloane to Corberic, ignoring Lysander's struggles. Certain Lysander wouldn't break free. You do the search while Drewin and Henwis will conduct the interrogation. I trust I may add the results of the interrogation on my revised report, he asked, turning to Daniel. Of course, agreed Daniel smoothly. I would expect nothing less. He curled his lip into a sneer and his eyes narrowed while he watched Lysander's frantic efforts to escape. Drudwin took a step backwards, jerking Lysander roughly off his feet, keeping him off balance and under control. Just make sure you adhere to regulation, Daniel murmured softly. You can count on it, said Sloane grimly. The regulations concerning interrogations were pretty loose. Royal security officers just couldn't kill, maim, leave lasting scars, or inflict injuries from which a suspect, in this case Lysander, would not recover. You can't do that to me, protested Lysander, renewing his struggles. Drudwin jerked Lysander off his feet again and tightened his hold, causing Lysander to gasp for air. Before you begin, said Daniel casually, while ignoring Lysander, I have a priority security alert to get out. He drew out the envelope containing information on the green-eyed girl and handed it to Commander Sloane. Make sure this gets done first. Yes, sir, said Commander Sloane crisply. Henwis, he commanded, take care of this immediately. It will take a while for Corberic to finish her body search anyway. Yes, sir, came Henwis' prompt reply. He took the envelope from Commander Sloane and sat down at his desk. Lysander erupted into struggle again, but Drudwin expertly threw him to the floor with a loud crash. Before Lysander could recover, Drudwin planted a knee in Lysander's back to prevent him from moving, and twisted Lysander's arm painfully up and around. Daniel heard a loud crack as bone in the arm snapped. Lysander screamed in pain. Ignoring the noise and its cause, Daniel moved back the way he had come and headed towards the red door. His business at Royal Security had concluded. Stop! Shouted Lysander between gasps of pain. Daniel paused and looked back at him without emotion. Lysander looked up hopefully at him. What about me? You broke the rules, Officer Lysander, Daniel sneered coldly. Did you think you could get away with that here? Lysander's hopeful expression changed to one of fear and desperation. But you can't just leave me with them, he pleaded. You have no idea what they're like and what they're going to do to me. Daniel turned to face Lysander. Actually, I do, he replied unsympathetically. I know exactly what they're like and what they're going to do. Daniel glided forward until he was standing over Lysander. Then he bent down and leaned over and whispered in Lysander's ear so softly no one else could hear. I also know what you are like, and what you did one cold November night 6 years ago. Blood drained from Lysander's face. He hadn't realized anyone knew that. Daniel straightened. Believe me, he added coldly, his voice still soft, but loud enough for everyone to hear. What lies behind the red door is infinitely worse. With that, Daniel wheeled around and moved swiftly back to the red door. It swung open as he neared, and Daniel entered without hesitating. Richards followed behind.